Chapter 8, Mishnah 1. Having taught in the previous chapter which produce has Shemitah sanctity, this chapter discusses how produce with such sanctity must be treated. This Mishnah teaches that whether produce may be put to certain uses depends on how that produce is generally used. The Mishnah first discusses produce that is primarily used as food. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. The sages stated a major rule about Shemitah produce. Any kind of produce that is reserved for human consumption. We may not make it into poultice for a person. For example, since wheat is generally reserved for food, a person may not use softened wheat kernels of Shemitah for a poultice. Since the produce is usually used as food, it may be used only for a purpose which, like food, is useful to everyone. It cannot be used as poultice, which is useful only to someone who has a wound. And we certainly may not make it into poultice for an animal. The Mishnah discusses another category of produce. Any kind of produce that is not reserved for human consumption, but rather is generally used as animal feed, we may make into a poultice for a person, but we may not make it into a poultice for an animal. A third category. And any produce that is not reserved specifically for human consumption or specifically for feeding to animals. Rather, it is sometimes eaten by people, sometimes by animals, and sometimes put to other uses, such as to fuel a fire. Its law is as follows. If, when he picked the produce, a person intended to use it both as human food and animal feed, we apply it to both the stringencies of human food, namely it may not be used as poultice, as mentioned earlier, and the stringencies of animal feed, namely it may not be cooked, since animal feed that has Shemitah sanctity may not be cooked. But if he intended to use it as firewood, it is treated as firewood, which has no Shemitah sanctity at all. Examples of such produce are pennyroyal, hyssop, and savory, various herb-like plants. These are all used sometimes as food for people, sometimes as food for animals, and sometimes as fuel for a fire.